History as it happens, July 22nd, 2021. Understanding Populism.
I have joined the political arena so that the powerful can no longer beat up on people who cannot defend themselves. Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it.
Populism's always been a slippery term, meaning different things to different people, existing on the right and the left. But all populists share something in common, a deep distrust of the powerful, who are aligned against the interests of the ordinary citizen, or at least that's what some demagogues want you to believe. If America is having another populist moment, it's time to understand populism. Next, as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
First thing you ought to do is get all these folks who've got these one-way trade agreements that we've negotiated over the years and say, fellas, we'll take the same deal we gave you.
2008, the greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street nearly destroyed the American and global economy.
So let's begin with a simple question. Well, maybe not so simple, but how do you define populism? We hear that word a lot these days. You know, our politics aren't conservative versus liberal, Democrats versus Republicans. Instead, it's establishment versus the people, or something like that.
There's no accepted definition of it. It's a word more like freedom or democracy. Some would say socialism, which can be defined in many, many different ways.
Georgetown University historian Michael Kazin is our guest today. He's an expert on American political and social movements. We're going to talk about capital P populists, the late 19th century political party whose issues seem outdated or irrelevant today, such as adopting silver coinage or banning foreign land ownership. And we're going to talk about small p populists of all political persuasions, from William Jennings Bryan to Huey Long, George Wallace, Bernie Sanders, and yes, Donald Trump.
I have seen firsthand how the system is rigged against our citizens, just like it was rigged against Bernie Sanders. He never had a chance. Never had a chance.
His acceptance speech at the 2016 Republican National Convention. So to his detractors, Trump is a fascist or a racist or just a con man. Today we're going to consider him a populist, in the vein of George Wallace. Now, Wallace is remembered today as an arch segregationist, a Democratic governor of a southern state who ran for president as a third-party candidate. But Wallace, like Trump, talked a lot about the swamp, although he did not call it the swamp in the 1960s or 70s. He talked about how the experts and the elites in Washington and at Ivy League schools do not know what's best for ordinary people. And Wallace ran on law and order, too, at a time when American cities were burning.
And it's a sad commentary when you cannot walk on the streets or in the parks in the large cities of our country. And if you go out of this building tonight and somebody knocks you in the head, the person who knocks you in the head is out of jail before you get to the hospital, and on Monday morning they will try the policeman.
I have a message to every last person threatening the peace on our streets and the safety of our police. When I take the oath of office next year, I will restore law and order to our country.
You know who else comes to mind right now? Ross Perot. He and Trump would have agreed on trade, another populist issue when free trade is believed to cause American jobs to move overseas or across the southern border.
If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, that's assuming you've been in business for a long time, you've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
I have visited the laid-off factory workers and the communities crushed by our horrible and unfair trade deals.
So Donald Trump ran as an outsider looking to drain the swamp, but he ran as a major party candidate, knowing a third-party bid would not prevail. If Trump is a populist on the right, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are on the left, railing against economic elites.
While Wall Street received the largest taxpayer bailout in the history of the world with no strings attached, the American middle class continues to disappear, poverty is increasing, and the gap between the very rich and everyone else continues to grow wider.
In the past year, the three largest banks in this country, J.P. Morgan, Chase, Citigroup, and Bank of America, have admitted to breaking the law and have settled with the government for a combined $35 billion. Now, as Judge Rakoff of the Southern District of New York has noted, the law on this is clear. No corporation can break the law unless an individual within that corporation broke the law.
You might say they are among the inheritors of Franklin Roosevelt, who was called a traitor to his class because of his economic populism. And further to FDR's left was Huey Long, and before Roosevelt, there was William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic presidential nominee 3 times, in 1896, 1900, and 1908. He lost all 3 times. Now, it might seem crazy to lump this group of politicians together, but their worldviews, their rhetorics do overlap some. That is, powerful forces, economic, cultural, political, are pitted against we the people. Let's talk about it now with Georgetown's Michael Kazin, the author of The Populist Persuasion in American History, as well as A Godly Hero, which is a biography of William Jennings Bryan. And he's currently working on a history of the Democratic Party that'll be published next year. Michael Kazin, welcome.
Glad to be here.
So I think this is going to be a timely conversation. We hear the word populism quite a bit these days, but it's a tough one to define. How does Michael Kazin define it?
Well, as you said, Martin, it's what philosophers call an essentially contested concept. That is, there's no accepted definition of it. It's a word more like freedom or democracy. Some would say socialism, which can be defined in many, many different ways. I define it really more as a language, as a way of talking about politics. In my book, I say it's a language whose speakers conceive of ordinary people as a noble assemblage, not bounded too narrowly by their class background, and the views its elite opponents as self-serving and undemocratic, and seeks to mobilize the people against the elites. That covers right-wing populists, left-wing populists, people who talk about the hardworking, often God-fearing, patriotic people against a self-serving elite. And the elite can be defined as a cultural elite, as a economic elite, as a political elite, sometimes all 3 in one. So to me, that is the most important. That's the definition of populism, which covers the most people who are called populists. And most people who call themselves populists would agree with that definition as well.
There was a capital P populist party in the late 19th century. We'll get to them in a moment. When did the term populist or populism arrive, so to speak, in American politics? And what did it mean at the time?
It arrived with that party, with the People's Party. Populist was the adjectival form of peoples. There were some journalists who knew some Latin, populus, the people in Latin. So you couldn't call the People's Party the Populist Party, so they came up with Populist Party. And from the 1890s on, the term was used interchangeably with the People's Party. The People's Party fell apart, in the early 20th century, but the term populism became popular again, I think, really in the 1950s and 1960s. A lot of people of various kinds, Ralph Nader on the left, George Wallace on the right, were called populists by journalists, and the term stuck. And since then, the last 50 or so years, there seem to be populists popping up everywhere at almost every moment.
And populists have been found across the political spectrum in our country. What are the main differences between right-wing and left-wing populists?
A couple. First of all, I think in general, and this is always very general, left-wing populists like, say, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, define the elite as primarily an economic elite, the corporate class, the billionaire class, as Bernie Sanders calls them. And they try to make as few differences among the people as possible. They talk about the 99% versus the 1%, for example. Someone like Elizabeth Warren is obviously from the cultural elite. She was a Harvard Law School professor, so she doesn't talk about the cultural elite. Whereas right-wing populists, Josh Hawley, for example, former President Trump, folks who were perhaps write for the Washington Times, op-ed page anyway, and certainly who are on some of the more conservative cable stations, tend to define the people as primarily white, not all white, but primarily white, and see there being a kind of a cabal, if you will, if not a conspiracy between a cultural and political elite at the top, sometimes helped by global corporations, and immigrants below who are taking jobs away from Americans, who are supposedly undermining American culture, trying to get people to speak different languages and so forth, rather than just English. So I think that's some of the difference between the two, but they can cross over. For example, there are certainly a lot of right-wing populists, like Josh Hawley, for example, like Tucker Carlson on Fox News Channel, who rail against big corporations very often, just as much as some left-wing populists do, but they do it often for different purposes, of course. And their solutions to the problem of corporate power are usually pretty different from the solutions of left-wing populists.
The populists of the late 19th century were immigration restrictionists as well, right?
That's overdone, I think. There were immigrants who were populists as well. San Francisco, for example, elected an Jewish immigrant named Adolf Sutro mayor in 1894. And there were miners in the West who were populists, who came from Irish backgrounds, German backgrounds, for example. What the populists in the 1890s railed against was alien ownership of land, immigrant bankers, real estate concerns. It was the idea that big British companies, sometimes big German companies, were buying up a lot of farmland for their own purposes, nascent agribusinesses that they were much more concerned about than they were about individual immigrants coming to the country. Saying that, there was certainly a prejudice by a lot of small farmers, white and black, in the 1890s against immigrants who were coming into the big cities, who they thought were beginning to give the cities more power politically than the small towns and agricultural areas it always had in America. So there was this kind of regional, urban versus rural antagonism, and sometimes immigrants were depicted as the reason why the cities were getting too powerful.
I've asked a number of historians and thinkers who've appeared on this podcast over the past 6 months how they define Trumpism, so I'd like to get your definition of Trumpism, because if mass politics is about grievance, some would say white grievance at this moment in our country's history, then populism would seem to thrive on grievance, and Donald Trump certainly knew how to tap into a number of grievances.
I would separate Trump from Trumpism. I think Donald Trump is one of the more successful entrepreneurs, self-promoters in American history. I'm not sure even when he was president or now he believes in anything very much besides himself. Now, one could argue that's true of most politicians, but even more true, I think, of Donald Trump than most politicians. Whatever helped him, he was for. Whatever hurt him, he was against. And, of course, he changed his politics in many ways over the years before he decided to run for president, giving money to the Clintons, for example. Trumpism, I think, is at base a populist impulse, if not ideology. It is obviously America first, believing that, as the MAGA slogan has it, there was a time when America was better off than now. And so in that sense, it is by definition conservative or even reactionary, because it wants to make America what it used to be, trying to go back to an idealized past when things were more stable, when ordinary native-born Americans were better off, supposedly. But and obviously it's a grievance, I think, against a lot of the changes that have taken place in America with mass immigration since the 1960s, especially with the let's say, sort of fluid gender roles that a lot of people, younger people, have accepted. And also, I think, and have to be careful here, because obviously there are African-American Trumpists, there are Latino Trumpists as well. But I think it is primarily a ideology or an impulse, which is a populism embraced by and spoken by native-born white people who feel that the culture has gotten beyond them and is hostile to them, the dominant culture. But also in many rural areas and former factory towns, that their industries, energy industries, manufacturing industries have declined drastically, which certainly they have, and that those who run the country don't care about them. And that, I think, is an important part of Trump's appeal as well.
That's interesting how you separated Trump from Trumpism, because there is this notion that Trumpism can't survive without him and his personality. But on the other hand, the ideas that he ran on were not new. He built on grievances about immigration and free trade agreements that weren't helping working class people. Do you see it that way too?
Yes, I think we see this around the industrial world, actually. In Europe, there are, quote, populist parties. There are some populist leaders like Orban in Hungary who speak many ways the way Trump has and the way people who support Trump have. The world has gone through a lot of changes economically and culturally in the last 30 to 40 years. And in this sort of post-industrial world and globalized economy with a globalized culture, very few political trends are just national anymore. They can be stronger in some nations than others, but I think the sense of grievance is very strong, especially in Western and Central and Eastern Europe. And that's one of the examples of how, if you might call Trumpism, is also Orbanism. It's also something that some of the right-wing parties in Germany have supported. So whether Trump runs for president again in 2024 or not, this impulse, these grievances are going to continue. He wouldn't have gotten so many votes just because he's a entertaining speaker. That's a very superficial way to understand politics. If you think one individual makes all the difference. As you said, Trump built on existing grievances. He built on them very well, not as well as he would have liked to win re-election, but nevertheless, the movement goes on whether or not Trump is there or not.
So you wrote a biography of William Jennings Bryan. The first time I heard of William Jennings Bryan was as a character named Matthew Harrison Brady in the movie about the Scopes monkey trial. Inherit the Wind, I believe, was the movie's title. The Bryan character was depicted as a religious blowhard and an ignoramus for opposing the teaching of evolution in school.
But your professor's a little mixed up on his dates. That rock is not more than 6,000 years old. How do you know? A fine biblical scholar, Bishop Ussher, has determined for us the exact date and hour of the creation. It occurred in the year 4004 BC.
But there was, of course, so much more to his life. He ran for president 3 times. He was a pacifist who resigned as Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. And as a populist, he supported issues that seem out of date now, like silver coinage. But the big populist themes were there, right?
Yes, in many ways, I argue in my biography of him called The Godly Hero, he was a precursor to the New Deal. He was a precursor to modern liberal Democrats. He was pro-labor. He was very strong for antitrust regulations. He wanted much more government regulation of corporations. Unlike most Democrats in the 19th century, he wanted government to be more powerful. He said government can do whatever it wants to do, basically, as long as it abides by the Constitution. And he did build on the existing populist capital P and also small p movement at that time. He had support from small farmers and workers in much of the country. Where he lost is because he lost in a lot of the big industrial states, which has the most electoral votes. His religion was fundamentalist Protestantism, but he defined fundamentalist Christianity as what he called applied Christianity. That is, he believed that a true Christian would want to solve the problems of society. And so in that sense, he was a social gospeler, a term that was very popular in the early 20th century. So at the same time, he was opposed to teaching of evolution in public schools because he believed, and this is interesting, he had a sort of, you might say, left-wing fundamentalism in this sense. He believed that Darwinism was social Darwinism. It was, in a lecture he gave a lot in the early 1920s, brother versus brute. That is, if children learn that nature was about the survival of the fittest and the strong should dominate the weak, then they would believe in eugenics. They would think that anybody who wasn't making it was just primed never to make it. There were a lot of people who were Darwinists who did subscribe to what we now think of social Darwinism. That is, Darwinism applied to society. Self-preservation is the first law of nature, that kind of thing. And so in that sense, he opposed teaching of evolution because he thought it would teach school children to be nasty to each other, teach school children not to believe in equality and democracy, but to believe that the strong should dominate the weak. So you could be empathetic to his beliefs without agreeing with them.
And social Darwinism was part of Hitler's worldview and the Nazis, so there was some overlap there. Huey Long, he comes along after Bryan, although I guess they were contemporaries. Huey Long is the governor of Louisiana in the late 1920s. He's an anti-corporate populist. He also proposed what we might call a universal basic income. The math didn't really add up, but it had a catchy name.
Share the wealth. Share the wealth.
Yes, that's what it was, and the math did not add up. But Long seemed to exist further to the left than FDR. The New Deal was decidedly centrist. So why is Huey Long important today?
Well, I think he's important because he's one of a number of populist-speaking politicians in the 1930s and today, too. And I mentioned Bernie Sanders before. I mean, Bernie Sanders is, a very different kind of profile demographically than Huey Long. However, Huey Long actually came from the one county in Louisiana that had a very strong socialist vote for Eugene Debs when he ran for president in the early 20th century. So there's some connection. But, he was anti-corporate. He ran against Standard Oil, which was a very powerful corporation in Louisiana at the time. Louisiana is still a very fossil fuel-driven economy. And he did also believe in making it much cheaper for kids in Louisiana to go to public university, LSU especially, and that has something in common with some left-wing populists today. He was very authoritarian, though. He would run campaigns against legislators he didn't agree with. He would try to smear them whenever he could, because he was assassinated by the son of one of the people he'd smeared. He had destroyed this man's career, and the man's son came after him and shot him. It would have been a serious third-party candidate, would Long have been in 1936 if he thought about running against FDR. And FDR was very afraid that if he ran a third-party campaign, he would win maybe a lot of southern states. And back then, if you were a Democrat and didn't win the southern states, you would have a hard time being elected president. So Huey Long was a formidable figure. And also he did have a very simple plan, as you mentioned. That is, he wanted to basically not allow anybody to make more than $1 million a year. Anybody made more than $1 million a year, the government would take away that money and distribute it to people who had much less. And that was the universal basic income you mentioned.
Well, that's interesting because today there's animosity toward billionaires who do not pay taxes, as we've come to learn. But a lot of these populists never really cracked the two-party system, right?
Yeah, well, those who ran outside the two-party system did. I mean, again, I would argue that people who talked a populist line, like FDR, like, of course, Donald Trump in very different ways, sometimes like Richard Nixon to a degree, too, when he ran as the candidate of Middle America and the candidate of the silent majority. They were talking a form of populism as well. I mean, populism is a very promiscuous language. It's a language which can be spoken by different groups, different individuals for different purposes. So in that sense, if populists are clever and run for a major party's nomination, they can do very well. I mean, Bernie Sanders came in second to Joe Biden, of course, and Donald Trump surprised almost everybody by winning the Republican nomination in 2016 with very different kind of much more populist language than very non-populist figures like, say, Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio.
George Wallace seems understudied, in my view. If any recent populist can be compared to Donald Trump in terms of style, substance, it might be George Wallace. What do you think of that?
I think there's a lot there. I think you're right in many ways. Of course, he was more of a regional figure than Trump. He was from Alabama. He was a segregationist, something which you cannot be anymore in America, thankfully, and get anywhere politically. But also he was very flexible, I think it's fair to say, in his political stance. For example, in 1964, when Wallace ran for the Democratic nomination for president, running against the incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, he ran as a stalwart defender of segregation. He ran what has to be considered very clearly an explicitly racist platform. But by 1968, when he ran an independent campaign for president, the American Independent Party, which was basically formed to be his vehicle for that race, he put that aside. He said, I have no problems with integration anymore. The voting rights bill had been passed. Black people in the South could now vote in large numbers, which they really couldn't in 64. And he appeared with union leaders on his platforms. He did very well among union workers in Michigan and Ohio. And he talked about not sending jobs overseas. He ran against rich liberal foundations. He ran against the media. So in that sense, in 68, he sounded much more like Donald Trump than he did at the beginning of his career in the early 60s.
And he had some success.
Oh, I should say one more thing to add. He was great attacking the media. He was very good attacking the liberal media. He would appear on television, meet the press, shows like that, and look right into the camera and talk about the lies the media was telling about him and how ordinary Americans knew what George Wallace was for, and the media was lying about that. And so in that sense, he was like Donald Trump as well.
Building on distrust of elites, the media, institutions, academics, experts. I've watched some of George Wallace's speeches on YouTube, and he spends a lot of time talking about how, those know-it-alls in Ivy League schools and in the big cities want to tell us how to live our lives here in Alabama.
Yep. Yeah, he talked about pointy-headed bureaucrats. And he talked about professors who couldn't even park their bicycles straight at a time when, only academics would be riding bicycles to work.
And as I said, Wallace had some success. He won several southern states in the 1968 election that Nixon won.
Most of the southern states, in fact. And if he won a couple more, the election would have been thrown to the House of Representatives, and he would have had a lot of power then. Because, as you know, each state only has one vote if nobody wins the majority of the electoral vote by the 12th Amendment. And so it looked like for a while, even though Nixon won a clear majority of the Electoral College, there were several southern states, North Carolina, Florida, a couple of others, where Wallace came close to winning a plurality of the popular vote in those states. And if he had, he would have gotten enough electoral votes to deny Nixon a majority.
So when it comes to the populists of the past and present, they've certainly run for office on specific issues, but as we've been discussing here, and maybe we can go a little deeper into it right now, they also embody certain attitudes about the world, about the establishment, the role of government and the common people. And when it comes to Trumpism, I sense that the movement, if you will, is focusing more on attitudes and culture war and less about specific policy. For instance, if you watch Fox News during the day, each show, especially at night, seems to be consumed with critical race theory, cancel culture, these culture war issues, a sense of victimhood and grievances against real and perceived enemies. And that kind of populism seems to be darker than maybe some of the earlier types. I don't know.
That's true. And I think even the People's Party, which was now considered a sort of social democratic party in many ways, a sort of central-left party, not that different from where the Democrats are going, really, under Joe Biden. But even then, populists often have a conspiratorial mindset, at least partly, left and right-wing populists both, because, after all, one of the things that defines populism, I think, most essentially, is a deep mistrust of authority, a deep mistrust of elites, a deep mistrust of those who say they know what's best for you. And that understandably often leads into a conspiracy thinking that they, quote, quote, are the enemy, and they can be defined in different ways, as I mentioned before. But there's usually a sense that if left to themselves, ordinary people will do just fine. The knowledge of ordinary people is superior to the knowledge of the elites who think that they know better than you do. And so even in the 1890s, there were populists who believed, and you can see this in their populist platform of 1892, the Omaha platform it was called, where it was promulgated. They talked about, in the preamble to that platform, the populists said there was a conspiracy hatched on both sides of the Atlantic against ordinary people. And so even then, they had a very rational set of demands, but they were motivated by a sense that those in power were conniving against them, even those who were elected supposedly by the people. So this is something which is true of Trumpism. It was true of the original populists too. One has to be careful to say that it goes along very often with a very rational set of demands, which make a lot of sense very often. I think some of the demands of right-wing populists and left-wing populists are good demands, especially in terms of the American economy being run for the interests of Americans and so forth. But nevertheless, there is a sense of grievance that often leads to a fear, even sometimes a paranoia, you might say, about what the elites haven't planned for us.
Yeah, I want to say that the populists of yesteryear and today are right when it comes to the failure of our institutions and our leaders over the past several decades. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a President Donald Trump. So the analysis that our country is not on the right track, that working class people are falling behind, that's not incorrect, even if the internal enemies are often vaguely defined.
That's true. I mean, there's always popular speakers in America. There always have been, going back to Thomas Jefferson and others in the 1790s, and you always will have them, I think. But it's true, you don't have people getting elected talking like populists unless there's a sense of crisis. Franklin Roosevelt talked like a populist in the 1930s, and that helped him get elected. Donald Trump talked like a populist in 2016. That helped him get elected. And one of the things about American populism, which is somewhat different from the populism of other countries sometimes, is that American populists often say, this is supposed to be a society for all the people, in the people's interest. That's what all men are created equal, and Congress is the people's house and so forth. So how come the people are being betrayed? Whereas some other countries define the national ideal more in terms of race or in terms of historical background. But where this country, being an American, is defined more by a sense that this country is supposed to be for everybody, supposed to help everybody, which of course is utopian. No society is going to help everybody equally. That's not possible. But I think the idea, the hope, the promise of America is rather utopian. And so we're always going to have populists because that promise is always going to be betrayed for one set of people or another set of people. So in that sense, populism will always be with us. But of course, it becomes much more powerful, has much more powerful appeal during times of crisis.
So here's a final question for you, Michael Kazin. As a historian, a public intellectual, I assume you believe you have a role to play in educating the public on these terms: socialism, populism, nationalism. But nowadays, of course, that's very difficult to do. The terms are often garbled, or they're just used as insults, calling somebody a communist or a socialist. So what can we do about that? Why is that so hard to establish clear terms in public discourse?
Well, it's hard to be a discourse cop, hard to be a language cop and say, no, don't say. I mean, I can make those arguments. I have made those arguments. I made the arguments on the left. I'm a leftist, and I made the arguments to my fellow leftists that Trump was not a fascist. But, all you can do as an historian, as a writer, as a teacher, is to tell the truth as you see it and use what knowledge you have of the past to tell the truth and to say, if so many people are fascists, then the term loses all its definitions. And as I said, what's one of the reasons I say populism is primarily a language, because that covers lots of different people, but I don't use it as a term of condemnation. Some people do. In some ways, I'm sympathetic with a lot of grievances that populists have. At times, a broader definition makes sense, but one has to define one's terms to talk like an academic.
Michael Kazin of Georgetown University, we thank you for your insights today. His next book, What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party, will be published next year. On the next episode of History as It Happens, few issues are as hotly debated today than the role of religion in American politics, going all the way back to the beginning, when we supposedly had a separation of church and state. That's next, when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.